child behavior is an issue that should be treated with the utmost importance. After all, children today will be the ones running society in the near future. Therefore, it is essential that they are raised well and learn to be good functioning people in society as they grow up. Because of this, some people wonder whether child behavior has gotten better in recent years or if it has gotten worse. In other words, are the children of this generation on track to become less responsible adults than the children of generations past? Naturally, the behavior from one child to another will vary drastically. But are there any clear generalized trends that will show in general which way child behavior is heading? Well, not exactly. The trends certainly are not clear-cut, and there have been plenty of valid arguments that will say child behavior has generally been improving, and those that have say it has been generally deteriorating. There are many factors to consider, and many arguments to explore, in order to come to a satisfying conclusion, and to prove our theory that child behavior now is in fact worse than it was in the past. Now, there is far more research into child behavior now than there was in the past, with less and less the further we get back in time we explore. However, that doesn't mean we can't find research into child behavior from decades ago. Back in 1925, a meeting of the American Psychological Association had a few papers presented relating to child behavior as discussed by H.S. Langfeld in his summary of the meeting. However, there doesn't seem to be much research done on the subject overall, as there's only a brief mention of child behavior research in Langfeld's summary. Although we may not have much research on child behavior in the 1920s, there was an interesting discussion in 1950 held by the American Ortho-Psychiatric Association about the existence of psychopathic behavior in children. Hyman Littman, a member of the association, stated that, quote, "We know that the aggression of the more serious group is compulsive in nature and tends to recur in spite of the fact that past experience has shown that repetition may spell disaster." Anna Freud refers to the aggression of narcissistic, dissocial children as having a wanton character, brutal and destructive, because of the absence of the affection or love components which under normal conditions moderate aggression, end quote. His argument that destructive, unruly children often act that way due to a lack of love and affection is an idea that is still relevant in child behavior studies today. Now, a couple of decades after this, in 1974, Bradley Falkoff asked a similar question to the one we are asking now. 15 years earlier, in 1959, Anthony Davids had tested a group of juvenile delinquents on time orientation and delay of gratification. Falkoff decided to perform similar tests at the same institutions to compare his findings to Davids's. Falkoff's study revealed that, quote, in 1974, the younger delinquents, aged 12 to 15, were much more present-oriented than were the similarly aged delinquents in 1959. For the older subgroups also, the 1974 delinquents were more present-oriented, but this difference is not nearly as great as that found for the two younger subgroups. If future orientation is a sign of ego strength and emotional maturity, then obviously today's early adolescent delinquents are more infantile, impulsive, and present-oriented than were their institutionalized, aged mates some years ago, end quote. If Falkoff's study can be trusted as fact, it seems that even the youth of 1974 were generally less well-behaved than the youth of just 15 years prior, or at least among the delinquent youth. But what about now, nearly 50 years after Falkoff's study? How is the behavior of our children today? There have been many developments in society since the 1970s that have had a major impact on child development behavior, some more recent and some more influential than the others. One major change that has had a tremendous effect on the children of today, when compared to the children of the past, is the increase in digital media usage. Nowadays, people are constantly using things like smartphones, computers, and the internet, things that are relatively recent developments, but they're now so ingrained in our culture that we may not always consider how drastically they've changed our lives. More importantly, we may not always be considering how drastically they changed the lives of this generation of children. Children today have a level of exposure to various types of media that is entirely unprecedented. According to Pedro Cardoso-Leite and others, quote, in the US, 8 to 12-year-old children spend an average of almost 6 hours on digital media every single day, with a substantial fraction of that time spent on multiple media at the same time, end quote. This is a large amount of time spent using digital media, so this level of media consumption must have some impact on child behavior. But what kind of impact? According to the study performed by Cardoso-Leite and others, that depends widely on the type of digital media. For video games, they found that, quote, overall, more time on video gaming is associated with faster response speed in the attentional control tasks. See Figure 3. Without, however, any concomitant increase in error rates that could have been indicative of an increased impulsivity or inattention. The largest effect was observed in the K6 distress scale, with more time on video games being associated with lower levels of distress, end quote. These results seem to indicate that playing video games can be beneficial for children. However, they also found that other types of media consumption didn't have quite the same positive effect. Cardoso-Leite and the others state in their study, quote, high levels of media multitasking are linked to higher levels of distress, K6, lower socio-emotional functioning, STQ, more behavioral and attentional problems as measured by both Connor's parents and Connor's teachers, as well as a reduced quality of sleep and lesser grit. No significant partial correlation is observed between media multitasking and mind wandering, mindset, grades, or any of the cognitive performance measures, end quote. This suggests that while some kinds of media consumption can be beneficial for children, too much media consumption, and especially media multitasking, can have various negative effects. One of the most influential forms of digital media is, of course, the internet. So how has exposure to the internet affected child behavior? Well, according to Genevieve Johnson's research, quote, results of analyses further revealed that indices of home internet use, elements of the techno subsystem, in general explained more of the variation in children's cognitive development than did family socioeconomic characteristics, elements of the microsystem, end quote. This implies that internet usage can have a significant effect on a child's development. But is this for the better or for the worse? There are arguments for both, and Johnson cites several in her own paper. Some of the arguments that say it has a positive effect on children state that internet use, and especially video games, can help cognitive development in children in areas such as pattern recognition and visual memory. Meanwhile, some of the arguments that say it has a negative effect on children state that video games and internet usage have been linked with things like distractibility, over-arousal, and aggression. Johnson's conclusion about whether internet use is ultimately good or bad for children is as open-ended as should be expected. Although Johnson does seem to assert that overall, internet use is a positive for children's development, as the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. This is a valid argument. However, more recently, many children are exposed to digital media at younger ages and at a higher frequency than before, which may start to tip the scale towards more disadvantages than advantages. An even more recent development that has had a major impact on children is the COVID-19 pandemic, which has obviously contributed to a drastic increase in digital media usage for people of all ages. So, how has this major global event affected child behavior in the last couple of years? The pandemic in 2020 caused a lot of isolation and media reliance due to the cancellation of social events, social distancing being strongly encouraged, and probably most relevant for children, school being held online instead of in person. This major shift towards online education, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, may have simply been an annoyance or even a relief for teens or older kids, but for younger kids, it may have had a much larger impact on their social development and behavior. In their initial research on the topic, Anna Gasman Pines and others observed that, quote, "The emergent research on child well-being during the COVID pandemic shows increased behavior problems and psychological distress overall," end quote. This supports her idea that the pandemic has especially impacted children and that it has had a generally negative effect on child behavior. Disruptions in schooling due to shutdowns or technical difficulties with online classes is a major part of the problem, as Gasman Pines and others found. Quote, "In terms of effects of these daily school and care disruptions on children's behavior problems, we found striking and consistent evidence that parents reported that their children had more behavior problems on days with a disruption than days without a disruption. Compared with days without disruptions, on days with disruptions, parents reported a 71% increase in the percentage of children who exhibited uncooperativeness, an aspect of externalizing behavior problems, and a 112% increase in the percentage of children who seemed sad or worried, aspects of internalizing behavior problems," end quote. Therefore, it appears that the various complications caused by the COVID-19 pandemic have had a notable impact on child behavior, and certainly not for the better, supporting the idea that child behavior is worse now than it has been in the past. So, how does child behavior now compare to child behavior from the past? After looking at all the ways modern events and advances have changed how our children act, let's compare the behavior of today's children with the behavior of the children of previous generations. The biggest and most obvious change that this generation of children growing up with that previous generations didn't is digital media. Digital media permeates every aspect of our society, and thus today's children are growing more and more accustomed to it. Video games, smartphones, social media, etc. have all been around for many years at this point, but the amount of exposure children are having to these things has grown tremendously in the past few years. As Pedro Cardoso-Late and others observed, quote, "Total hours of media consumed per day increases with age. At age 8, children consume on average 4 hours and 28 minutes of media per day. At age 12, that number increases to 8 hours and 14 minutes per day. For each additional year of age, total hours of media consumed increases by almost a full hour," end quote. Considering this article is from last year, it can be assumed that these statistics are similar enough to those of today. What this tells us is that even children as young as 8 years old are consuming over 4 hours of digital media every day. And of course, the older a child gets, the more media they'll consume daily. Therefore, the question we must now answer is whether that high amount of digital media consumption has had a generally positive or a generally negative effect on child behavior. This will, of course, be a major factor in how child behavior today compares to child behavior from the past. Firstly, we will address the numerous benefits digital media has had on child behavior. While many negative effects may come readily to mind, one has to remember that these technologies were created for a reason, and all types of digital media can have positive effects if they're used in moderation. So, what are some of these positive effects? For starters, many types of video games have been found to have various benefits for both child development and behavior, such as improving visualization, memory, and recognition skills. Other types of digital media can also help with learning, as these mediums can provide several educational benefits if they are used for that purpose. However, on the other hand, too much media consumption can lead to a variety of behavioral issues, such as overstimulation, hostility, and attention issues, especially when a child is using multiple sources of digital media at once. Many parents use digital media as a source of both education and entertainment for their children, which is obviously fine in moderation. However, some parents become too reliant on these sources of entertainment for their kids, and that's where most of the problems lie. This issue has become more widespread and relevant in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, as society in general has had to become more reliant on digital media due to social distancing. This has made a small but still concerning trend in child behavior issues into something far more significant. In conclusion, it appears that technological advances of the 21st century have had a more negative effect on child behavior overall. While these technologies can have a beneficial effect on a child's development if they are employed correctly, overexposure and overuse of digital media can cause various behavioral problems for a child. In the past few years, more and more children are consuming too much digital media as our culture becomes increasingly reliant on it. Younger children are now being exposed to smartphones and, by extension, things like social media and video games, which can be more harmful for them if they continue to consume too much, which they often do nowadays. In addition, even before these developments came about, children are becoming more impatient and impulsive than those of the previous generations. It seems that as our society advances to make our lives easier, it has also had the unfortunate side effect of making our children more entitled and less well-behaved than children of the past. Therefore, we can ultimately see that while child behavior may have improved in some ways with the more recent changes in society, overall, children today are less well-behaved than the children of past generations. Thank you.